what is the point of even talking about draft needs? Everyone talks about needs. It's like, I don't care about needs. You're going to need 5 different positions that you need this year, next year, when, all stuff, hits the fan. I don't think needs matter nearly as much.
Hallo und herzlich willkommen zur 184. Folge vom Cover 2 Podcast. Mein Name ist Luca und Simon ist aktuell nicht bei mir. Ich wollte auch eigentlich nur kurz das Ganze hier introieren, denn wir starten heute in unsere Draft-Vorbereitung beziehungsweise unsere Draft-Coverage mit einem ganz besonderen Gast, Austin Gayle von Pro Football Focus. Hat sich bereit erklärt, mit uns ein wenig im Allgemeinen über das Thema Draft und Evaluation von Prospects an sich zu sprechen. Und ja, im Endeffekt bleibt eigentlich nur zu sagen, wünschen euch viel Spaß damit und am Sonntag geht's dann weiter mit, ich glaube, der ersten Position Group. Müsste ich jetzt Simon fragen, aber ihr werdet das dann schon sehen. Viel Spaß mit der Folge. Okay, it's quite late for us, but we are delighted that Austin Gayle is joining us today to kick off our draft coverage for 2021. He is the Associate Director of Content at Pro Football Focus and hosts the 2-for-1 Draft podcast with Mike Renner, an all-year-round draft-related podcast. Usually, he's the one asking my questions. Austin, please introduce yourself really quick. Did I miss something? And are you ready to be the one questioned today?
Absolutely, man. I'm excited. My name is Austin Gayle, Pro Football Focus Associate Director of Content and the host of 2-for-1 Drafts, a Rookies and Draft Prospects podcast. I really appreciate you guys having me on.
I hope you are well. How is life in COVID times over there in Cincinnati?
You can't complain. I've been saying COVID, okay. In considering COVID, I'm doing okay. But if in a real life, it probably isn't that great. I've been stuck in my house longer than I wish. I'm looking forward to getting vaccinated and approaching the summer as I hope to in 2020. We'll see how it goes.
You have the luxury to go to the office at least. For me at least, I'm stuck at home for about a year right now. Simon also has some time at the office, but I guess we have to maybe get used to it a little bit longer.
Yeah, I guess so, man. It's been a crazy year. It feels like a year, but I guess it's been longer than a year now. It's been a wild one.
Really appreciate you being here today and consider you right now, like you always say, a new friend of the podcast.
Absolutely.
So let's get started. Our main topics today will be, of course, this year's draft class. But like I already sent you, we have some time left. We'd like to pick your brain on some other topics like PFF draft evaluation and some diversity questions we had for you. The 2021 NFL draft. In the following weeks, we already plan to go through all the position groups and give our takes. But what's your general opinion of this year's class, maybe compared to recent years?
Yeah, I think it starts with the quarterback group. This is one of the best, if not the best, quarterback class we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. It's, there are 3 or 4 legit number 1 overall pick potential players. You could, if Trevor Lawrence wasn't in this class, Zach Wilson would go number 1 overall. If Zach Wilson and Trevor Lawrence weren't in this class, you'd see Justin Fields go number 1 overall. Like, it's that good of a class, in my opinion, that where you're going to see, I think, 4 quarterbacks go inside the first 6, 7 picks. Like, that's how good this quarterback class is. And I think I'd expect the first 3 at least, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Zach Wilson, to be legit week 1 starters in the NFL and still obviously have time to develop and groomed to be franchise caliber quarterbacks. That's how good I think this quarterback class is. Trey Lance is in a tier after those guys just because we haven't seen him play a ton of football, only averaged 18.3 dropbacks per game at North Dakota State, even in the year he did play in 2019. And then obviously only 1 game against Central Arkansas in 2020 due to COVID-19 concerns. I do think that the quarterback class dominates the conversation. I think it's a very deep offensive tackle class. I think it's a very good wide receiver class. Corners we're seeing now, Patrick Surtain, J.C. Horn, Caleb Farley, some legit insane athletes at the cornerback position in this class. And that doesn't even get into Elijah Molden, a really good slot cornerback prospect. Obviously, Javon Holland, who could play the slot or safety. Asante Samuel Jr., I talked to him this morning. That's another guy where you're going to get a lot of talented cornerback prospects in this class as well. It's a very good cornerback class.
What would you say, maybe besides the quarterback class this year, is the strongest position group of all?
I think I would go offensive tackle, and I think it's not
Okay.
as top heavy as last year's. Obviously, you saw Jedrick Wills, Andrew Thomas, Mekhi
Mm.
Becton, and Tristan Wirfs all go really high in the draft. I think all before pick 13 or pick 14. I don't think it's that good from a top heavy perspective, but right now, 8 different offensive tackles rank inside the top 40 on PFF's draft board. It's a very deep class where I think you'll see a lot of offensive tackles go off the board between picks 20 and 40. Guys like Christian Darrisaw, Tevin Jenkins, Jalen Mayfield, Sam Cosmi, Walker Little. There's just a lot of talent at the offensive tackle class this year, and I think so much that you're going to see teams jump on grabbing offensive tackles at the back end of the first round at the top of the second.
Besides Penny Sewell, who is maybe standing out for you even in this deep group, and or for example, maybe or give us one player not many people are that high on right now in this offensive tackle class.
Yeah, I think after Penei Sewell, I really do like Rashawn Slater of Northwestern. I think he may get kicked into guard, potentially, depending on the team he's drafted to and how they view him. But I would start him at tackle. He's got the feet, the athleticism, the quickness to play offensive tackle in the NFL, and he meets the arm length threshold. It's not like he's going to be working against that. I think Rashawn Slater at tackle will be very good. I don't think he gets past the Chargers at 13. That's where I think he ultimately, his floor in the first round really is. I would be really surprised if the Chargers didn't take Rashawn Slater if he was available to them. And then after that, I think the offensive tackle I'm higher on, or PFF is even higher on compared to the consensus, is Walker Little of Stanford, a guy who was a former 5-star recruit that had a very good 2018 season, so much that we were highlighting him as a really big 2020 draft candidate, but then got hurt after one game in his 2019 season, did not play, and then obviously opted out of the 2020 season. He just hasn't played a ton of football. He's a crazy athlete, and you saw that at his Stanford Pro Day, but I just don't know how teams are going to view him not playing football over the past 18 plus months. I would talk to him on the podcast, and he said, I haven't seen a collegiate pass rusher, go against me in over 18 months. Like, that's a concern. It's going to take him some time when he gets to the NFL to adjust to the speed of NFL pass rushers. However, in due time, I do think Walker Little, maybe not year 1, but year 2, year 3, develops into a legit starting caliber offensive tackle. I think if he did play the 2019 and 2020 seasons, you're talking about a top 10, top 15 player in this class.
From a value perspective, which round would you draft Walker Little this year?
I mean, I do think that the NFL is going to be lower on him, and playing the market, I would probably take Walker Little at the top of the second round. I wouldn't let him get to the third round. I would not. Absolutely not. If your Walker Little's on the board in the second, I'm taking him. But I do think that I would be comfortable taking him in the first if my team, say in a front office, felt like he would be off the board by our pick in round 2. However, in the first round, not only do you want, starting caliber players, you want starting caliber players that can start in the first 2 or 3 years of their rookie contracts. And I think Walker Little might need a year to develop and adjust to the speed of the game before he can play. So I think he ultimately does fall to the second, if not the third round. And I'd be sprinting the card in if I could get a tackle like Walker Little on day 2.
What is your personal O-line rankings in this draft if you would go maybe to the second round, so round 1 and 2? How many O-line players do you got there?
Offensive tackle, or all offensive line?
Offensive tackle then.
All right, let me see here. Let me look at PFF's latest big board. I know Penei Sewell is obviously the top offensive tackle in this class for us. Unlike we've seen, Daniel Jeremiah have his Rashawn Slater ahead of him, and so does Lance Zierlein of NFL Media. But right now it's Penei Sewell in a tier by himself, and then then Rashawn Slater. I don't know if I put him in that same tier as Christian Darrisaw because he's just like such a different player. Like, you're getting so much of a different player in Rashawn Slater than what you're getting in Darrisaw. Darrisaw, a bigger, monster in terms of the run game and that kind of stuff, while Rashawn Slater is a lot quicker, more athletic, better movement skills, those things. But the big 3, so to speak, is Penei Sewell, who right now is the 4th-ranked player on PFF's draft board, Rashawn Slater of Northwestern, who ranks at 12, and then Christian Darrisaw at 15 on PFF's draft board. After that, you can kind of pick your flavor. Tevin Jenkins of Oklahoma State, Dylan Radins of North Dakota State. Then I'd probably put Walker Little in there, right ahead of or right after Sam Cosmi, the Texas offensive tackle, who I talked to today and is an absolute stud. Dude is brilliant. I really like Sam Cosmi. The interview was awesome. The athleticism is insane. Walker Little and Sam Cosmi should be viewed very, very similar. 2 insane athletes. Sam Cosmi, though, has played a ton of offensive tackle already. He has a ton of reps there at Texas in the Big 12. So I think those would be my top guys. Soon after that, I'm talking about Alex Leatherwood of Alabama, Jackson Carman of Clemson, who I talked to him on the podcast. He said teams see him as a tackle. I know some people want to kick him inside to guard. If he can He's still very young. I think he's still 20, 21 years old, can still develop both from a physical perspective and a technique perspective. I think Jackson Carman. And I think that's where there's a bit of a drop-off after this class. Then you have guys like Liam Eichenberg of Notre Dame, Jalen Mayfield of Michigan, who maybe kicks inside to guard at the next level, and then some real projects in James Hudson of Cincinnati, Deontay Smith, East Carolina, Spencer Brown, Northern Iowa. You're going to get to some projects after that.
You mentioned the disagreement in quotations with Daniel Jeremiah regarding Penei Sewell. Would you say he's the best non-quarterback prospect in this class?
I think so. I think he is the best non-quarterback prospect in this class. But you know who it's close with? It's close with Kyle Pitts, man. The more I look at Kyle Pitts and the athletic profile and the positional scarcity, because positional scarcity at the tight end position is interesting because Kyle Pitts, and Mike said this on the podcast, Kyle Pitts could come in and be a top 3 player at his position as a rookie. Like that's how good Kyle Pitts is. And that's also how bad the rest of the tight ends in the NFL are. And when you think about TJ Hawkinson going at 8 to the Detroit Lions, who does not offer anywhere near the rarity and skill set that Kyle Pitts brings to the table, I mean, why not take Kyle Pitts at 5 if you're the Cincinnati Bengals? Why not take Kyle Pitts at 3 if you're the Miami Dolphins? Let's get interesting here. I think it could be one of those situations where it's a conversation between Kyle Pitts and Penei Sewell to be the first non-quarterback off the board. And I know Jamar Chase should be in the conversation. Jalen Waddle should be in the conversation. After these pro day numbers, maybe Patrick Surtain is in the conversation or J.C. Horn. I still think, though, it's between Penei Sewell and Kyle Pitts, who should be the first non-quarterback off the board.
Okay. I already listened this morning. I guess I'm one podcast behind your latest one. I guess Mike compared him already to Darren Waller, Kyle Pitts,
That's
when
right.
I remember correctly. And do you think the same of him? Has he the potential to have an immediate impact like Darren Waller has in Las Vegas right now?
What's funny is that I gave that freaking comparison to Mike originally. It was him. He took it from me. I told Mike, because Mike and I were thinking about comparisons for the draft guy, and I was like, what he kind of reminds me of? Darren Waller. And he's like, no, that doesn't make sense. And then you look more at the measurables, and like when Darren Waller was coming out, like they're very similar in size, and I think they have very similar 40 time, at least projected for what Kyle Pitts will run. I think he ran a 4.42 on his Instagram story, which I mean, I'll run a 4.5 on my IG story as well tonight. But I do think that Kyle Pitts is very similar to Darren Waller and can have a Darren Waller impact. And we talked on that podcast too, which I thought was an interesting conversation, is where does it go wrong for Kyle Pitts? Because you're talking about a player now that is one of the best tight end prospects you've seen over the past 10, 15 years. How does it go wrong? And I do think usage is going to be important. Like if you exclusively use him as an inline tight end, he's not going to be as productive as you need him to be if you take him in the top 5. However, if you use him like the Raiders use Darren Waller or the Chiefs use Travis Kelce, whether he's playing outside receiver, slot receiver, inline tight end, and doing all these creative things, that's where you could actually get legitimate value out of Kyle Pitts. I wouldn't be surprised. I'd be interested to know what his prop number will be for receiving yards in year 1. It obviously depends on situation, but I mean, he's a guy that could come out and have 1,000 yards receiving in year 1 if he goes to an offense where there's a target share that would be favorable to him.
Yeah. You already mentioned the wide receiver class and all those amazing guys. It's quite controversial topic, especially in German football Twitter. How would you rank those top guys?
The wide receiver group, I think it's tough, man. I do think that it's all wide receiver 1A, 1B, and 1C. And I think right now I have Jamar Chase as my number 1 receiver, and then Alabama's Jalen Waddle as the number 2, and then Devontae Smith at 3. But all 3 of those guys rank inside the top 8 on PFF's draft board for a reason. Like all 3 of them are rare wide receiver prospects that should come into the NFL and be very successful right out of the gate. I like Jamar Chase the most, mostly because even after opting out of the 2020 season, at 19 years old, what he was doing to SEC cornerbacks, future top 50 players in that 2020 draft, A.J. Terrell, C.J. Henderson was drafted, 9th overall by the Jacksonville Jaguars, Trayvon Diggs, top of the 2nd. Like he was doing things to NFL cornerbacks at 19 years old that I don't think we've seen any receiver do on the outside in the SEC. That's how good Jamar Chase was. And I still think he can get a lot better. Like he can get better as a route runner. He can get better I think working the vertical route tree, but he's still already very good. And people forget that Justin Jefferson, who just broke Randy Moss's rookie receiving yards record, was second fiddle to Jamar Chase in that offense. Like Jamar Chase was the primary target, the primary deep threat, the guy working on the outside. I do think that don't overthink Jamar Chase. Don't take a Jalen Waddle or Devontae Smith over Jamar Chase, because I do think he's that good. However, all these guys are going to be very good, and it's going to depend on usage and quarterback play and those things to see who's actually the most productive. I think Jamar Chase, though, is the best prospect.
Okay. Quarterback is a great keyword because those guys, you get information of them left, right, and center. All Twitter is full of them rankings. But I'm interested in a prospect apart from those top 4 guys you think has the chance to be in the NFL for longer, or maybe the longest, maybe as backup potential or even as a starter.
So are you saying the quarterback class after the big 4? I do think that Mac Jones obviously could have a lot of success as a quarterback. I think his floor is like a really productive backup, like a very accurate, quick decision-making backup. I do think that after those guys that will likely get drafted in the first round, I mean, you have to flock to Jamie Newman's tools, Kellen Mond of Texas A&M, Davis Mills of Stanford. I don't know if I put Kyle Trask in that conversation. I'm interested in Kyle Trask. I don't know if he does fall to the second or third round, how likely he is to work his way into a starting role and keep it just because of accuracy concerns and different things. But I do think Kyle Trask should be at least mentioned in the conversation. But if I am looking for a quarterback on day 2 or day 3, I'm looking for tools. I'm looking for guys that could come in and potentially light it up. I know I can find a clipboard carrier in the NFL easily on the open market. What I want is a guy that can maybe blow up or provide something that my current quarterback or starting quarterback can't do. So I do think I would flock to Kellen Mond, Davis Mills, Felipe Franks, maybe late day 3, a guy who's like 6'7", built like a tight end with a cannon.
That's the Hail Mary guy, right?
Yeah, it's the Hail Mary guy. Felipe Franks, former Florida quarterback, transferred to Arkansas. I need to look up his height, weight again because I'm pretty sure he's built like a tight end. But that's another guy where it's like having that guy in your quarterback room is going to provide a different skill set.
According to your draft guide, he is, let me check, 6'6", 228.
Wow.
That's right. And I think he had his pro day recently, and it came in, let me find this pro day number for you here. I'm pretty sure he came in a little bit taller, came in 6'7" or something. Wow. It's kind of nuts. Oh yeah. So Felipe Franks comes in at 6'6.5", 234, and ran a 4.58. He ran a 4.58 at 6'6", 234.
Incredible.
I think he should maybe move to tight end. I don't know. I don't know. It's wild that he's that athletic. And when you think about those guys with tools and at the quarterback position, rocket arm, great size. I think he's a former 4-star, former 5-star recruit. Why didn't it come together? Why were you never all that successful at Florida? Why were you not significantly successful at Arkansas? And that's where so much of the media doesn't get a magnifying glass on. You don't get to know Felipe Franks as a person. You don't get to know his off-field habits. You don't get to know what he's like in practice. And I think that's where some of that has to show up because, you are objectively one of the more athletic, from a size and athleticism profile standpoint, quarterback prospects in this class. Why didn't you put it all together? Let's find out that. And I think that's where a lot of his evaluation will come.
Let's go a bit off rails here. It's draft season, and more importantly, it's mock draft season. And you're taking your turns with Mike on your pod, taking your turns on the different mock drafts from all the experts out there. I'm interested in what's the most ridiculous and maybe the most underrated draft take you heard this season.
Most ridiculous, underrated draft. I've heard or I've had a lot of bad takes, but
you've heard.
Heard. Okay.
What's ridiculous, and on the other side, maybe a pretty underrated take.
So I don't know if you guys have seen this yet. Chris Sims of NBC Sports, who recently released his quarterback rankings and his wide receiver rankings, he had De'Ami Brown ahead of Jalen Waddle as the third best receiver in this class, which is obviously very different, very off the rails. But I don't even and he obviously has Zach Wilson ahead of Trevor Lawrence, which is, again, another interesting take, a little bit off the beaten path. But have you seen his cornerback and safety rankings? He does not have J.C. Horn in his top 6, not even in his top 6 cornerbacks. And then at safety, Trayvon Moehrig, not existent in his safety rankings either. He has Andre Cisco as his number 1 safety. And then I think for corners, Marco Wilson of Florida is ranked ahead of J.C. Horn, according to Chris Sims. Those, I think, so far, of all the Chris Sims takes we've seen, have been the most surprising at the least. And Chris Sims, excellent evaluator, excellent football mind, all of those things. A guy that we were trying to get on the podcast to talk about his evaluation process and those things. But to not have J.C. Horn or Trayvon Moehrig in your top 5 defensive back list for corner and safety, that I'm interested to know what he doesn't like about those two, because those two guys are dogs in my opinion.
Do you think they kind of get bored of the mock draft season somehow, so they put it
I
in the
don't know if
spice
it's
in it?
I don't know if it's much as boredom or evaluating prospects in a vacuum. I think I've talked a lot about on the podcast about, don't be overconfident in your own evaluation, factor in other people's work, consider other opinions, those things. I think you are actually building a draft board to draft off of. And that's what everyone's trying to do. Obviously, Mike builds his draft board just for media and kind of his opinion on the class. But if I was building a draft board preparing for the 2021 NFL draft, you better believe I'm going to include the consensus of other opinions of media. And when you do that, you start to create some levels of groupthink bias and those types of things to where no one wants to have J.C. Horn outside the top 5. Say you watch all of J.C. Horn and have never read a piece of content on the website, on the internet. Maybe you don't have him inside your top 5 based on what you're seeing in those things. But I do think you have to factor in what other people see in these prospects. Guys like Lance Zierlein, guys like Mike Renner, Dale Jeremiah, Bucky Brooks, Mel Kiper, Todd McShay. These guys have been doing it for a long time and have seen a lot of prospects come through over the past 10, 20 years. I think factoring in their opinions of players, I think, is very important when you're building a draft board. And if you are objectively higher or lower than the consensus by multiple basis points, you need to go back to tape and confirm that. Because Chris Sims now, at multiple positions, is off base on a lot of different things compared to the consensus. And at that point, if I were Chris Sims, I'm not sure if he's doing this, I haven't talked to him a ton, I'd start to think about my process. You start to think about, okay, how am I seeing the game so much differently than everybody else? What am I doing differently? And I think some of that stuff's got, and he could be right. I mean, he's had a good hit rate with the quarterback classes of late. He had Antoine Winfield Jr. as his top safety last year. Like, he's been right. I'd be interested to know what his process is and how he's evaluating these players, because at this point, you can't knock him. You can't knock what Chris Sims is doing. Obviously, he has a brilliant line. But something that's interesting and something that I take into account when I'm evaluating each class.
Another question we like to ask you is, because of COVID this year or even last year, but especially this year where we have no combine and only pro days, do you think it's an advantage for players and a disadvantage for teams?
So I get asked this question a lot. I think it is definitely an advantage for players from a media perspective, because obviously you're more than likely going to test better at your pro day. It's because these things are hand timed, they're unofficial, they're not. There's a lot of different things that come into play in terms of how your team is measuring your measurables. I mean, that's a proven fact. However, when you talk to Daniel Jeremiah, who was a former scout, you talk to other guys who are current scouts, they don't build a draft board based off combine numbers alone. They build a draft board based off the best time they get. If that is on Gil Brandt's stopwatch at the combine, they're going to use that. If that's on, someone's laser time at a pro day, they're going to use that. It's not so much that they look for a standardized testing as much as they go ahead and look for the best time. If you ran a 4.21 at your pro day and a 4.4 at the combine, we're going to take the 4.21. That's what I've heard from NFL media and guys like Daniel Jeremiah and those things. However, if I was in a front office, I wouldn't do that. I would obviously chase a standardized version of testing like the combine does present. But I don't think the front offices are necessarily going to there's not going to be that big of an effect on measurables and those things. Where I think there's a bigger effect is the interview process. Like, so many evaluators talk about how important it is to interview players in person at the combine. And now with COVID-19, teams aren't even allowed to fly these guys in for private workouts and those things. That's the bigger impact. You could see teams either taking more risks on players because they weren't aware of situations from a character perspective, or less risks on guys that they haven't had the opportunity to meet in those things. It's going to be interesting to see how teams treat off-field rumors. Guys like Micah Parsons, who has some off-field concerns. Guys like Puka Williams, Josh Ball, a handful of others that where there's some off-field rumors. Or Kelvin Joseph, guy from Kentucky who transferred from LSU to do, I think it was failed drug tests. It's like, okay, that's a player I'd like to talk to. That's a player I'd like to have in the facility before I commit to, Kelvin Joseph. Zoom meeting, Zoom call, you can only learn so much. I do think it's easier to hide some things and that stuff. So, plus, everyone thinks about interviews as in talking to the players. Teams also talk to coaches. They talk to other players on the team. They talk to parents, all that stuff. They do their due diligence when they're looking into prospects. And if you only have Zoom call opportunities, it's going to be that much harder to really get a full, in-depth breakdown on any player.
Simon mentioned the COVID impact even last year. And with all the opt-outs, do you think it's possible that those guys will be struggling stepping into the NFL, going from a year of zero experience on the field to like an even higher speed, game speed right now?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think that, everyone I've talked to that has opted out, like guys like Greg Rousseau, and so forth, they've said that, like, they're in the best shape of their life. They've done nothing but work out over the past few years, past year, and they're ready to go. They're ready to play in the NFL tomorrow, whatever. But I do think it's more than just being in game shape. It's being game ready in terms of actually, putting on the pads and playing a full football game, preparing a game plan and those things. I do think you could see, similar to this year, I mean, this year you had rookies come in with no offseason, and this stuff like come in a little bit slow. And I think you could see that with some of the opt-outs as well.
And another topic, the free agency is around about 1 week in and pretty much already happened. Are there any major changes through the free agency for the outcome of the draft? For example, the Giants, and do they draft a receiver because they got Golladay now, or something like that? Do you see there any major changes from a team perspective in the NFL?
I honestly think the biggest change coming out of free agency is just that the Atlanta Falcons are likely not taking a quarterback at 4. If you talk about like stuff that most impacts mock drafts, them restructuring Matt Ryan's contract so they're kind of pot committed to him through 2 years just makes me think that they're not going to swing the bat on a quarterback like Justin Fields or Trey Lance at 4, because the benefit of having a rookie quarterback, or a large part of the benefit of having a rookie quarterback, is that you get him on a cost-controlled contract for 4 years plus the 5th-year option. If you're spending 2 of Justin Fields or Trey Lance's years with him sitting behind Matt Ryan, and that's if you don't commit to Matt Ryan even beyond that. Look what happened with the Green Bay Packers. They're considering a contract extension for Aaron Rodgers, so much that Jordan Love, while a valuable pick from, since you're picking a valuable position, was good, you're not going to see Jordan Love play for a long time, and so much that like you kind of ruin that opportunity to take advantage of a cost-controlled contract for a rookie quarterback. So I think that was like a big impact for sure. I think the Giants is a good thought. I mean, they added Adoree Jackson, they added Kenny Galladay, 2 kind of big needs for them where maybe you could see them go offensive line at 11. Maybe think about a Rashawn Slater at 11. And I know some Giants fans will be really upset if they pass on receiver, but Kenny Galladay, Sterling Shepard, Evan Ingram, like you're starting to get to that point where do you make Darius Slayton? Do you make that luxury pick on your 3rd or 4th top target in an offense? Do you do that at 11, or do you try and drastically improve the offensive line? Because last year, that was one of the worst interior offensive lines in the NFL. Like, I mean, they started Nick Gates at center a handful of times, and he did not play well. I'm forgetting the guy out of Oregon, who I think was undrafted, started at guard for them last year. But they did not have a good interior offensive line. You bring in Rashawn Slater, who could play tackle for you if you wanted to out of the gate, or kick inside the guard. I think that would be a power move for the New York Giants. But those are 2 teams where what they did in free agency will likely impact what they do in the draft. I think a lot of the other teams, like, for example, the Cincinnati Bengals, some people are saying, oh, we signed Riley Reif. Maybe we don't need Penei Sewell. If you were a Riley Reif away, I'm telling you right now, if you thought you were a Riley Reif away from not needing a potential future Hall of Famer at offensive tackle, what is the point of even talking about draft needs? Yeah. I always have this rant on the podcast too. It's like everyone talks about needs. It's like, I don't care about needs. You're going to need 5 different positions that you need this year, next year, when all stuff hits the fan. I don't think needs matter nearly as much, especially in the top end of the draft. In the top 50 picks, if you're drafting for need in the top 50, you're doing it wrong. You need to draft for value, and Mike says that all the time. You're not going to be in a bad position drafting the best player available at any position, especially if your big board, like PFF does, factors in positional value.
And that's why I am asking myself, how upset any Bengals fans have to be if the Bengals doesn't take Penei Sewell.
And I think they will be upset. I mean, I definitely think they'll be upset. However, I do think if they grab Kyle Pitts at 5 and start Riley Reif and Jonah Williams at tackle, and then maybe grab an interior offensive lineman on day 2 and day 3, that is a strategy I could get behind. Because I'm telling you right now, okay, Joe Burrow, Tyler Boyd, Kyle Pitts, that you're starting to have a conversation about a very good offense. And but I don't think you go wrong. I think that's how good Pitts and Penei Sewell are. Like, you can't go wrong. Take Sewell at 5 if you want. Take Pitts at 5. Where you go wrong is, reaching on a Rashawn Slater at 5, or I think taking interior defensive line. I mean, there's ways to go wrong there, but I don't think you can go wrong with Pitts or Sewell at 5.
Or maybe trade back, take Slater and
yes. I've talked a ton about trading back in this class. If the Cincinnati Bengals, so if I'm wrong and the first 4 picks aren't quarterbacks, and say a Trey Lance or a Justin Fields there is at 5, this is a very good offensive line class to trade back in. And I know that would mean passing on maybe a Penei Sewell. But if quarterbacks don't go 1 through 4, Sewell likely came off the board. You probably already lost Sewell maybe to the Miami Dolphins or the Atlanta Falcons, whoever it was. I do think that if you're sitting there at 5, Sewell's off the board, and you're then in a position to trade back because the team wants to come up and grab Fields or Lance, trade back. Pick up Darisaw and an extra second-round pick, or pick up Rashawn Slater and an extra second-round pick, and watch you completely retool this offensive line. Like, this offensive tackle class is really good. Interior offensive line, too. Kendrick Green, Illinois on day 2. Wyatt Davis on day 2. Elijah Vera-Tucker you could take late day 1 if you traded that far down. I really do think that trading down, if you have needs along the offensive line, could be the power move that the Bengals do take.
You talked to so many of those guys already. Is there anyone that stands out for you? Maybe you even have a favorite guest?
That is tough, man. I did love talking to Rondale Moore. Rondale Moore was very, very locked in. And I'm if you listen to the 2-for-1 drafts, I'm kind of a lighthearted, funny guy, and I make jokes about myself. I'm a little sarcastic. Every time I interview these players before officially comes on, before we're on the air, I try and open up a little bit. I'll try and throw a joke their way, ask them, where they're at, what food have they been eating out there in Cali, if they're working with Exos, whatever. Rondale Moore, man, locked in, dude. It was you couldn't get the guy to break a smile before we started recording. And I think those guys intimidated me, because I'm not saying I'm the funniest guy in the world, but I'll tell you what, dude, I think I'll get you to crack a smile if you give me a chance. But Rondale Moore, dude, locked in. And then no one knows this. I haven't even told this story. Before that interview, I said he's a Kentucky guy because he went to high school in Kentucky, was a former Gatorade Kentucky Player of the Year. And he says, dude, I went to Purdue. And I was like, dude, I didn't mean that. I know you went to Purdue, man. It's like, oh, dude, we started off on the wrong foot. But
Gotcha.
We actually go on, when we got to the interview, and I encourage you guys, if you are listening, to go and listen to that interview. He was just a super smart, super diligent, business professional, all that stuff that came out with him. And I think he, of anybody, you think people say like there are people or media analysts that say there are people sleeping on Rondale Moore. There's nobody that thinks people are sleeping on Rondale Moore more than Rondale Moore. He is very upset with how much people are knocking him for his injury history. Oh man, he's coming in with a chip on his shoulder that might actually have him listed at 5'9" if he had him on his feet. Don't bet against Rondale Moore. I'll say that. You go obviously value analytics, value the fact that there aren't a lot of successful 5'7" receivers in the NFL. Value that, but don't bet against them. I'll tell you that. You don't want to be the team that doesn't pick Rondale Moore.
Okay, that's amazing preview of this year's class. I'd like to get into the whole evaluation process where your interviews are obviously part of. And when you get into that, at PFF in general, for me, it's always 3 main aspects. It's the physical aspects like injury, the build, and his genetics, his genetic traits, the technical abilities, his game, his positional understanding, and the mental side of things like personality, leadership, work ethic, and so on. Do you agree with my take here? And would you be so kind to rank those 3 for us?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do think measurables, I think that's what you spoke to at the start. I think measurables would be one of the most important aspects. There are certain thresholds that just looking at analytics, looking at measurables and success rates at certain positions that hit the 6'2" mark, that hit the 80-inch wing and those types of things. Like measurables, I think, are very important. And I do think that on-film ability comes in right at number 2 for me. I do think that what you've shown on film is up there in terms of with measurables, and what you're looking for on film is seeing those measurables translate to success on the football field. And I think oftentimes you see that. You've seen that with J.C. Horn. You've seen that with Patrick Surtain. You've seen that with quarterback prospects like Trey Lance, Zach Wilson, Trevor Lawrence, etc. Because there is this whole mantra of like built like Tarzan, plays like Jane. Like if you are a freaky athlete with all the measurables in the world, but it doesn't show up on the football field, that's a big red flag. Why are you a freak? Like, here's an example. Josh Imatorbhebhe, wide receiver of Illinois. Absolute freak from an athletics and measurables perspective, but an afterthought in that offense. Why? That's a question. I think that's where the other stuff comes in. Is it medicals? Is it off-field? Is it love for the game? Is it these different things that like we can't always see because of the access we have to these players? I think the other or the miscellaneous category is everything that doesn't show up on either a stopwatch or on film. It's these things of what you're doing in school, what you're doing in practice, what are you doing after practice? All that stuff really does matter when you're trying to turn, and I say this a lot, you're trying to turn a 20, 21-year-old kid into a legitimate multi-million-dollar professional. Let's throw athlete out the window, throw football player out the window. You're trying to turn this person into a multi-million-dollar professional with all the spotlight on him. I'll tell you right now, that is so much more than running a 4.3 40-yard dash or catching 10 touchdowns in a season. It is very different when you start to get paid and you start to have the limelight on you and those things. How are you going to react to money in your pocket? How are you going to react to media coming at you for drop passes? That matters, man. That the true professionals, I think professional does not get brought up enough in evaluation. The true professionals are guys that last in the league for a long time and find their way to work on special teams and those things. And you rarely can see that at a combine or at a pro day or on the all-22. It's when you meet these people and you talk to them in person. I think that's why, again, people bring up the combine not because of you get excited to watch people run in underwear. You get excited to talk to these players and find out who these players are.
So that was one of our more diverse questions, but I think it's fitting to put it into this topic right now, because you frequently mentioned the idea of investing more in guiding prospects instead of scouting resources. Can you explain this idea of a personal assistant for rookies and the impact you hope to get with this approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting one I've gotten a lot of feedback for it of late, but I do think that when you're trying to turn, again, 20, 21-year-old kids into professionals, I think there's a lot of opportunity to pull from the scouting and evaluation budget and invest it in development, invest it in not just developing players on the field, like technique coaches like Chuck Smith, who works with pass rushers, or Eric Crocker, who works with DBs. Like, I think investing in those types of guys is important as well, because you're going to have position coaches like defensive backs coaches and linebackers coaches that, yes, are teaching scheme and these things, but most of what they're doing is inputting game plans for certain position groups and those things. What you need also, in addition to improving technically, is also, I think, people on your staff that can help them improve as professionals, guys that can help them improve managing their money, avoiding certain party favors like drugs and alcohol, especially if there's a history of abuse in there, and a lot of other off-field character stuff. Like, I think you want to put your prospect in the best position to succeed. And that does not mean just putting $10 million in his pocket, winding him up and letting him go. I think a lot of this time you need to bring him in and have some levels of onboarding to make sure you're preparing X player for media days. You're comparing X player to when that first paycheck hits and those things. I think the development of these players off field is so important to their long-term success in the NFL, to where NFL teams would be smart, especially for top 50, top 100 picks, where your investment is so big. Imagine if you're buying, you hate to see it like that, but imagine if you're investing in a piece of something to help your business. That's what you're doing. You're drafting a player to help your business, to help your football team, whatever. If you're putting that much investment in it, you're going to want to also make sure that investment falls through. And I think that starts with developing players and those things.
What do you think? How realistic is that? And maybe does Rondell Moore need such a personal assistant?
I do think it's realistic, and I'm sure some teams already do invest resources in development. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think that your first round pick should have a significant help becoming a professional in the NFL. But I do think that there's evidence based off hit record and hit rate for certain players over the past 5-10 years that we're not doing enough of it. Whether we're doing it yes or no is still up for debate. I don't have that level of access. I haven't talked to a ton of teams like that, but I do think that there's more room for it. I do think there's a lot more room to develop players, because I said this before, it is not hard to identify a good athlete. With all the access we have to film, with all the access we have to pro day and combine information, it's not that hard to say J.C. Horn is a good athlete. It's not. I mean, it's very easy. What's hard is turning J.C. Horn into a 10-year starting caliber cornerback, all pro. That's hard. And that's not just because he ran a 4.39 today. It's all the off-field stuff. It's keeping him on the football field. It's keeping him healthy mentally and physically.
We also often get questions like, how do you start evaluating prospects? And over the 3 years of doing this podcast for Luca and me, we have developed our own ways and methods. But maybe you can give us some general tips you can share with us and our listeners on how to get started in draft evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first place to start, depending on like your level of football knowledge, is just to read a ton of books. Read a ton of books, read a ton of articles, and look at, um, studying the game better, getting a full understanding of what is asked of a cornerback in the NFL, what is asked of a linebacker in the NFL. I think that's like obviously a really good place to start. You want to enter scouting and player evaluation with a very good understanding of what players are asked to do in this game. And I think there's sometimes where you can jump the gun and you want to just start watching and start having takes on players. That's always, a bit of a concern. That can always be a bit concerning when you don't understand or fully understand what's going to be asked of a player in the NFL. I think the next thing would be obviously getting access to the film. It's easy to kind of scout highlights or scout certain broadcast film on YouTube, but if you're looking at defensive backs, corners, wide receivers even, it can be very difficult to scout those positions without access to all 22, end zone angle, and obviously the all 22 angle from the sideline. I think that is something that helped me a ton over the past 3 to 5 years. You're going to scout an outside cornerback on broadcast film. Good luck. Like you don't get to see 70% of what he's doing. Like you just don't. Yeah. And that's no knock on people that want to do that and are trying to do that. I'm just saying, if you want to evaluate a deep safety prospect, you better have access to all 22, because it's going to be so difficult to do that when you don't get to see him for 80% of the time he's on the football field. So I do think the access to film is super important when you are evaluating. I also think get feedback wherever you can. I think this applies to all matters in life. Get feedback wherever you can. If you can start publishing analysis to a website, to Twitter, to YouTube, to Instagram, to TikTok, wherever you're publishing analysis, go get feedback. Sometimes you're going to seek out professional feedback. Say you want to reach out to an analyst and say, hey man, I'd love to give me 5-10 minutes to walk through my process, walk through this, whatever. That's always good. But not everyone has time for that. You reach out to Mel Kiper Jr. right now and ask him to read your mock draft. I doubt he does. But what you could do is go get feedback from from people. You start a Twitter account that says, it's your Twitter account, and you start publishing takes on these guys. I'll tell you right now, you'll get feedback pretty quickly, especially if they're bold. Yep. You'll find people saying, there's no way he's this good. There's no way you're right. Or you'll start to get people saying, no, I agree with you. No, I see that in this defensive player, or whatever it may be. So I do think getting feedback is super important. Don't scout in a vacuum. Don't do anything in a vacuum. When you're creating content, if you want to be a content creator in your life, you have to go seek out feedback. You have to go find ways to get better. When I was first started doing this podcast, and I still think I get this feedback now, I talk really fast. I move a little fast. I can sometimes think too quickly in those things. I got a lot of that feedback, something I'm working on, all that type of stuff. So I definitely think getting feedback is important.
Yeah, and different opinions are, I think, the main thing which makes this draft period so exciting. Considering that, how often does it happen that you are in contrary opinion to the PFF draft board you already mentioned at the beginning?
I think there's a handful of times where I am in contrary. I'm trying to think of specific players where Mike is maybe a bit higher on than I am. I remember last year Mike was higher on Brandon Ayuk than I was, but I was probably wrong there. I think originally I did not love where we had Rashad Bateman, but the more I've watched him and the more that I've kind of like talking to him about the difference between 2019 and 2020, him catching COVID-19, like, you get more on board with what he's done. I'm higher on Jalen Phillips than Mike originally was as well. I was a big Jalen Phillips fan before Mike moved him up to 28 on our board. We had some disagreements, but now we're more in alignment. I think you're talking about what Mike does a good job of. Mike does a really good job of taking other people's opinions and factoring into his own. He does not scout in a vacuum. He is consistently looking to evaluate his own process and find ways to get better. And I think that's why, he's one of the best draft evaluators we have.
Perfect. What's the most important resource, maybe for PFF or for you, especially for evaluating in this times? Film stats, production grades. What's your take right now?
It's definitely the film. Right now with PFF and the film access we have, I can go watch all of J.C. Horn's targets on the outside on third downs right now. I can do that you give me 2 minutes, I'll start watching that. I can watch all of Javonte Williams runs where he's contacted at or behind the line of scrimmage. I'll watch those right now to get an idea of his vision and how often that's happening and when it's happening, what type of runs. I can go watch all of Javonte Williams runs on power, on counter, on outside zone. That is huge. That is massive in terms of making it an efficient process to actually evaluate talent and those things. Watching, you go back, and I've talked to Daniel Jeremiah, who has access to the same stuff we do because we work with the NFL Network and stuff. He says, I'll go in and watch a quarterback and watch all of his third down throws, just back to back to back using PFF. And that tells you a lot about a quarterback. You can find out how quickly is he processing on third and longs? How quickly is he delivering the football to his first read on third and longs? How often is he moving off his first read? Again, that access to that film and the ability to be as efficient as we are with it, I think is a massive resource in terms of building a draft board and developing these takes.
Okay, and apart from that, I guess also your interviews, I want to talk about this topic as well, are a big part, I believe. Do you grade those interviews? And when you do, how do you grade them?
I do not grade the interviews. That's a great question, though. I don't grade the interviews. I do tell Mike that when I do interviews, there are ones that I've had interviews with players that I've never even put on the podcast in previous drafts because of how bad they've been. And I've never been the guy to bring up bad interviews. I'm not going to do that to a player's stock. I'm not going to intentionally kind of hurt a player's stock by talking poorly about an interview or airing a bad interview and those types of things. I do think I come out of some interviews saying, man, obviously nervous about some things, nervous about how he answered some questions and stuff like that, compared to other interviews where it's like, oh man, this is one of the smarter players I've talked to. This guy really gets it very quick, very, you can kind of get an understanding of like quick wit and those types of things from players very quickly. So I don't grade them, but I definitely put them on a scale. And when I'm talking to players, things I'm looking for is obviously quickness with answers, being, smart about things, being engaged, all that type of stuff I think does matter.
Can you give us an example without calling out a name?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I asked a wide receiver from a few years ago in the draft who ultimately went undrafted and doesn't play in the NFL anymore, but was considered one of the better prospects. And, ask him what he feels he needs to do better. He says, I don't need to do anything better. I just catch the football. So, okay. How do you feel, what part of your game best translates to the NFL? At the receiver position, he's like, all of it. And it's like, okay. He just kept kind of going through it. It's like, all right, man. Well, I appreciate it. And he's like, of course. And it's out. And it's like, all right, that was scary. That's not a good interview,
Nope.
And obviously, who am I to, this guy can put no effort into an interview with me, but put 10 times the effort into an interview with the team. Still, though, I do think how you approach that from a professionalism standpoint is interesting. When you're talking to a player and you can tell he's disinterested or you can tell he's too full. I mean, go back to Ja'Kai Polite. Ja'Kai Polite goes up to the podium at the combine and is brutal with the answers. What do you think you need to do better? Nothing. How have teams given you feedback? Oh, they don't like my game a lot, or whatever he said at that podium. Didn't go up to a podium again. His agent pulled him. Interviews can kill you, man. If you don't interview well, it can kill you. You saw that with Ja'Kai Polite, and I think teams, Matt Rule at the Senior Bowl said he was in an elevator with a player for 15 minutes, or not 15 minutes. That would be a long elevator ride. But he was in an interview with a player, and by the time he got out of the elevator, he said, I would never draft that player because he just would not fit from a character perspective, not fit the team. And it's like that, again, I do think coaches and front office people think like that because you're not just drafting a chess piece. You're drafting a human being that's going to be in your locker room, that's going to be at practice and do all those things.
I'm just here so I don't get fined.
Yeah, but Marshawn Lynch is different, though, in that Marshawn Lynch just hated media. Marshawn Lynch, if you talk to him one-on-one, you hear players talk about Marshawn Lynch, all this stuff. He is just like an otherworldly teammate. What he's done in the community for Oakland is incredible. What he didn't like is media. He didn't like people asking him dumb questions and stuff like that, which you kind of have to respect.
Considering that there are some sorts of bad interviews, is there something like a most overused sentence you like always hear where you say, okay, come on, man, that's what everyone's telling me?
I do think that something that gets said a lot, and I don't think I knock any players for this, but if you ask them where they want to play in the NFL, they say they play anywhere. It's like, and I think that's fair. Obviously, I mean, and again, I don't knock them for it. You would, if you talk to a corner who will likely play in the slot because he's 5'10", 180, you ask him where he wants to play in the NFL, he says, I'll play anywhere. It's like, okay, but you're probably going to play in the slot, so let's talk about it. That's some of that sometimes agents will prep players and those things to say like, hey, don't speak to the specific role you're going to play in the NFL. You have to say you're willing to play everywhere. You have to be, you talk to, who's another example that I've had that conversation with? It's like guys that will most likely play slot receiver in the NFL, like a Tutu Atwell or say a Jalen Darden who's a little bit smaller. It's like, okay, could you see yourself playing in the slot in the NFL? It's like, yeah, I could play there. I could play outside. I could play special teams. It's like, okay, I get you. But let's talk about realistically. You're probably going to play in the slot. Let's talk about that. But I do think you have to respect players, or even like defensive linemen. It's like, I can play edge. I can play 3 technique. I can play nose. I can do whatever you want. Rashad Weaver's a good example of that. He said, he asked me 3 years ago, what position am I going to play in the NFL? I'm going to say edge, edge, edge. But now, I'll play inside. I'll do whatever you want.
Besides that, do you've talked about what's important for evaluating players, college players, in the draft, of getting feedback, and you do a bunch of Mailbag podcasts, every week. Do you use other resources apart from PFF, or I think you use, but what other resources do you use? Maybe confer with external experts like Bucky Brooks, Daniel Jeremiah, or ESPN guys like Kuiper?
Yeah, that's tough, man. I think some other resources that I do use, PFF recently added to its tools for team clients and full-time employees a tracker of measurables and how they stack up from a percentile perspective against certain positions and against certain weights. That's something that I've started to leverage, that PFF introduced this year, that I think is awesome. I also listen to a ton of podcasts. I read a ton of articles from guys I really respect, or analysts I really do respect. And I think that has helped me out a ton too. Because what you don't necessarily always want, you don't need to always agree that this cornerback is the best, this cornerback is the second best, and this cornerback is the third best. And you want to align with every analyst. But you want to make sure you're seeing the same things. If I think this player is stiff and another analyst I really trust thinks he's not stiff, it's like, okay, someone's seeing something wrong. Is it me or is it him? I'm going to go back and watch the tape. But if you see you're seeing the same things, and maybe he has them ranked a little bit higher than you, or she has them ranked a little bit higher than you, you're at least in the same boat. Like, for example, Rashawn Slater. If I saw an analyst that I respected say Rashawn Slater is stiff and struggles to get out of his set, I'd be like floored. I'm like, oh my God, I don't know what I'm looking at. I obviously am lost. I need to go back and watch the tape, or I'll read more analysts and those types of things. It's like, okay, I need to figure out who's wrong here. Is it me or is it him? I think it's more important when you're reading other people's work to kind of like evaluate it based on yours. Don't worry about the ranking. Worry about what they see. If they see different traits or different skill sets than you, I think it's an opportunity to evaluate your process, compare theirs to others and stuff like that. So that way you can start to get in a position where you're seeing some of the same things.
Sounds good. You're doing this for a few years now. You have quite the experience evaluating and giving your takes on the different college players. What would you say is the biggest miss, or maybe the biggest sleeper that turned out quite well in the past years?
Interesting. Let me think here. I've had this question asked me a handful of times. I was big on JJ Arcega-Whiteside. I did really like his game, and I thought he was going to be a better player than what he's been in the NFL. Looking at some of the other players I thought Josh Jackson was going to be very good coming out of Iowa. He has not been the player we expected him to be, or I expected him to be, rather. Trying to think about some other players that I thought Rashad Penny was going to be better. RIP, San Diego State. Hate to see that. So an interesting take, though, and I don't pound my chest on this one a ton. I did not love Jadeveon Clowney coming out. I didn't like the effort. I didn't like the knee history. The knee injury history. There was a lot of stuff that told me, at least when I was looking at him, like, man, I don't know if I would take him ahead of Khalil Mack. I don't know if I would take him at the number 1 overall spot. I think there's enough concerns here to maybe back out, but he was such a rare athlete that I think he obviously went so high as he did. And I still think when I ultimately put together rankings that draft, I kind of backed out of what I originally was going to do and stuff like that. But I think I wish I banged my chest a little bit harder for the fact that, like, maybe Jadeveon Clowney isn't the best defensive player or best player overall in this draft, because I didn't see it. I saw the athleticism. Everyone saw the athleticism. The dude was a freak of nature, but I just didn't see it all put together at South Carolina. And I think we were assuming that he'd get there. And then you saw that those reports came out that he had like 40-year-old knees. Like, his knees were like deteriorating. And you see now he's a free agent. He's been a long time free agent for the past like 2 or 3 years. Like, he's been like picked up late in the season or whatever it was. I think there are a lot of concerns with Jadeveon Clowney's game. He has not lived up to expectation.
Yeah. Considering that you at PFF, you have a very strong opinion always on several prospects. And I often hear you guys criticizing front offices for several decisions. Which front office would you say acts most similar to PFF ideals in terms of draft, free agency, and so on? Are there many? Is there none?
That's very interesting. I think Andrew Berry and what he's done with the Cleveland Browns over the past 2 years has been very close to how PFF sees roster building. I think the Baltimore Ravens for a long time have done a lot of good things from a roster building perspective that PFF would align with. I think the Colts are in a similar vein. Arizona in some ways has done some good things, but I do think the first teams that come to mind are Baltimore and the first team I mentioned, I'm missing. Oh, Browns. I think Baltimore and Cleveland have both done a lot of things that PFF would side with, and they have really good analytics departments. You know, the Ravens have a very good analytics department, and so do the Cleveland Browns. I think you're seeing them make those data-informed decisions in free agency and the draft with how they're building their rosters.
So we are recording for almost 1 hour right now. Do we have a few more minutes? Because we have two questions left. Great. Because one topic that is always hot, especially on German football Twitter and even American football Twitter as well, is the value and opinion on drafting running backs. What is your take on that? I believe on 2-for-1 drafts, you mentioned that Gio Bernard is the only running back right now remaining with 5+ years on the team that has drafted him. How high are you on drafting running backs? I believe I've already heard not before the second round. What's your take on the running back topic?
Yeah, I do think that, the best running back in any class I still wouldn't take higher than pick 33 because I do think the fifth-year option for a contract on a more valuable position matters. Like taking valuable positions in the first round because of that cost-controlled contract and that fifth-year option is so, so important to a point where the best running back you've ever seen, I don't know if I take him until pick 33. And I think it's so much more. The conversation, again, is so much more than just running backs don't matter. Running backs aren't valuable on the football field. Their production is based on offensive line play, opponent box count, etc. Throw that out the window. Pretend running backs are the most valuable players on the football field every single time they suit up. They're not, but pretend. But then look at how the NFL currently values them on the market. They're one of the lowest paid positions in the NFL. Philip Lindsay has 2 back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons under his belt and is going to get paid like $3 million this year. Meanwhile, Trey Hendrickson, who's not even top 20 at his position, is going to get $15 million per. Like the NFL market, a real market, not this like some people think like valuing positions on the field is fake. You can't do it, whatever. Throw it out the window. Fine. Pretend running backs matter more than quarterbacks. The NFL doesn't value them that way. The NFL values them where the market is right now, where the average running back gets paid like $6 million a year, while as the average offensive tackle, average quarterback, average pass rusher gets paid $10, $12 million a year comparatively. So like using the market analysis of how the team, NFL currently values running backs, I would not be valuing them highly. Like I would not be drafting them highly. I say for the same reason, box safeties, off-ball linebackers, I'm not drafting those guys highly because you don't have to pay a lot to get good ones. Same with interior offensive linemen. The highest paid center in the NFL, Corey Linsley, signed with the Los Angeles Chargers, makes $12.5 million a year. You're telling me I could get the 10th best center in the NFL for probably 60% of that? Why would I draft one in the first round? That makes no sense. You draft when Saquon Barkley was drafted at number 2 overall, he was immediately on his rookie contract paid as the 5th highest paid running back in the NFL. You drafted a player and immediately paid him the 5th most at his position. You draft an offensive tackle at number 2 overall, he ranks outside the top 30 in terms of how much he's paid per year. And that's like that. You're always looking to, from a pay perspective, get a positive return on investment. If I'm paying a player to be top 30 at his position, I expect him to be there. And I think when you're drafting an offensive tackle at number 2 overall, you're hoping for that out of the gate. For a running back, to expect Saquon Barkley to be a top 5 running back out of the gate, it's like, okay, we're really going to invest in this guy and we're really going to prop him up. We're going to feed him 300 carries a game, all that, or 300 carries a season. That's where the conversation is for me, because I'm tired of trying to convince people that running backs aren't as valuable as maybe as you think on the football field. I'm easily able to explain how they're not market valuable compared to where the NFL currently pays the position.
So maybe to draw a line, maybe from Rashad Penny, we already talked about him, to drafting running backs in the first round, maybe ultimately to the Seattle Seahawks. What would you say are the main reasons for bad drafting by teams?
I really do think it's one, positional valuation. You can have, you can bring in a running back or a box safety or a linebacker in the first round, and they could be very good and still not really live up to that pick because they don't play a valuable position that impacts the football field or impacts the market spend enough. I think positional valuation is probably the number 1 reason. Number 2 reason I do think is development. It's bringing in players and playing them out of position, not utilizing them correctly, not helping them off the field, not building them into professionals. That is the number 2 thing. I've said this before, and I'm sure you've heard this on the podcast. Players do not bust. Teams bust.
Mhm.
Teams are the team. They're the decision makers that made Isaiah Wilson a first round pick. They're the decision makers that made Rashad Penny a first round pick. They're the people that put such high expectations around a player. He did not bust. He was drafted obviously way too highly. Both Penny and Isaiah Wilson and some other. Jonathan Abrams of the Las Vegas Raiders is another reach. Like, it is not hard. It's so unfair for fans to turn on players more quickly than they turn on front offices. But when you think about NFL fandom and the toxicity of NFL fandom, it's like they're going to ride with the Raiders, the logo they have tattooed on their back, before they ride with some random player or whoever it is that they overdrafted. I think that's where I have the concern right now. I do think positional evaluation is the number one reason. But after that, I do think it's development, man. Like, you have to be putting these players in a position to succeed out of the gate.
Maybe one last question. I saw right now Adam Schefter posted that the Browns are hosting Jadeveon Clowney for a visit right now. You said the Browns maybe the closest to the PFF perfect drafting teams, and your opinion on Jadeveon Clowney. What's your take on that?
We just talked about how Andrew Berry does a lot of smart things, and getting a Jadeveon Clowney, I do think, depending on the price point, obviously, it could be interesting. And I really do like finding creative ways to get better as a pass rushing team. And Jadeveon Clowney, I don't think will cost a lot of money considering the interest that people have had in him, the injury history, all that stuff. I like him as a player at a certain price point. I start to not like him as a player at a different one. I think I've talked about a ton about the Cleveland Browns at 26 in the first round targeting a pass rusher. That's where my mind jumps right now.
What would be a break even for that? 10 million per year?
Probably 10 million is where I'd lean. Anything over 10 or 11 or 12, it's like, I think it has to be also very incentive laden. The teams don't take enough advantage of incentive laden contracts. I would put it at a base. Pay him $5 million guaranteed and have him work into a $10, $12 million contract with sacks and those things.
All right, Austin, thank you so much. Great insights. It was amazing talking to you. I hope we can stay in contact and maybe get you on for another episode after the draft. Would you be open to that?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
Great.
Perfect.
All right, then we'll finish it off here and hope we see us in the near future. Goodbye.
Bye.
Perfect.